There are mountains thousands of meters high that can still be reached by roads, established camps, and regular expeditions. But there are also mountains far lower than that, where the distance between humans and the summit feels like an invisible wall. In this list, we'll count down from number 10 to number 1. Each mountain is difficult to reach for a different reason. Cliffs, pristine rainforest, the open ocean, the Arctic, extreme cold, desert isolation, international borders, and finally, a remote region almost completely cut off from the outside world. And the most surprising part? The mountain at number 1 is only about 735 meters high. So how can a mountain that low be harder to reach than peaks over 3,000 meters? Let's begin. 10. Mount Lico, Mozambique. Mount Lico rises to around 1,100 meters, but its elevation isn't what makes it remarkable. At the summit is an almost circular forest plateau surrounded by towering cliffs. To reach the forest on top, the 2018 expedition had to overcome a nearly vertical cliff about 125 meters high using a fixed rope system. Around 28 scientists, climbers, and support team members took part in the expedition. And after climbing the cliff, they didn't find an old climbing route or an established campsite. They entered an almost untouched forest. Researchers discovered rare species, endemic plants, and even pottery fragments suggesting that humans may have reached the area centuries ago. But once you realize ancient people may have found a way up here, one question immediately appears. How did they get past these cliffs? Mount Lico proves something very simple. A mountain doesn't need to be high to become a fortress. But if Lico is locked away by cliffs, the next mountain was hidden from the outside world in a completely different way. From Mozambique, we move only a short distance south. But this time, what we're looking for isn't hidden behind rock. It is buried inside a massive forest that once appeared as a mystery on satellite imagery. 9. Mount Mabu, Mozambique. Mount Mabu rises to around 1,700 meters and is covered by a tropical forest spanning roughly 7,000 hectares. But what makes this place extraordinary is that the forest received almost no attention from scientists until 2005. Researchers noticed an unusual patch of green on satellite imagery. When they zoomed in, they realized it wasn't an ordinary forest. It was a tropical ecosystem covering the slopes of a mountain, isolated from the surrounding landscape. Mount Mabu eventually became known as the Google Forest. But Google Earth can only tell you that a place exists. It can't take you there. Research teams had to travel along rough dirt roads, deep into remote rural areas, and then continue along local trails. The final 3 miles of one survey required pushing through dense vegetation, and when they finally arrived, they discovered numerous rare species that science had barely documented before. A forest covering thousands of hectares had been there all along, but it took a satellite looking down from hundreds of kilometers above Earth for the modern world to truly notice it. Finding a place on Google Earth is easy. Getting there is the adventure. And if Mount Mabu makes a journey over land difficult, the next mountain creates an even bigger problem. You have to cross an entire ocean. 8. Queen Mary's Peak, Tristan da Cunha, South Atlantic. Queen Mary's Peak rises to around 2,062 meters on the island of Tristan da Cunha in the South Atlantic. The island is only about 13 kilometers across, yet it lies roughly 2,173 kilometers from St. Helena. And there's one very simple problem. Tristan da Cunha has no airport. To get there, you have to travel by ship. A voyage across the ocean can take around 6 to 7 days. In other words, before you even start climbing Queen Mary's Peak, you have already completed a journey of thousands of kilometers. But the mountain's history is even more dramatic. On October 10th, 1961, the volcano began erupting. Around 260 residents were forced to evacuate. They were taken to Cape Town and eventually to Britain, before most eventually decided to return to their island home. Today, Queen Mary's Peak isn't necessarily one of the most technically difficult mountains to climb, but that doesn't make it easy to reach, because sometimes the greatest challenge isn't on the mountain itself. It's thousands of kilometers away from its base. And from the middle of the Atlantic, we move toward a place where even identifying the highest summit was once a mystery. From Tristan da Cunha, we head north to the Arctic wilderness of Alaska. 7. Mount Isto, Alaska, United States. Mount Isto rises to about 2,735.6 meters. It is the highest peak in the Brooks Range. But for decades, people weren't certain about that. Older maps had Mount Chamberlain ranked higher. Other datasets produced different results. Eventually, modern aerial mapping technology changed the answer. FODAR measurements showed Isto at 2,735.6 meters, while Hubli stood at around 2,717.6 meters and Chamberlain at approximately 2,712.3 meters. A difference of just a few dozen meters was enough to change the identity of the highest peak. But reaching Mount Isto is the real challenge. There are no roads leading directly to its base. The practical approach is by bushplane, landing in the wilderness and then continuing under your own power. No hotels, no convenient trails, no nearby rescue infrastructure. Only Arctic tundra, glaciers, and weather that can change rapidly. Mount Isto presents an interesting paradox. Humans can measure it to within a few meters, yet actually reaching it remains an entirely different story. And if Alaska tests you with isolation, the next mountain will test you with something no map can soften. The cold. 6. Gora Pobeda, Siberia, Russia. Gora Pobeda rises to around 3,003 meters in the Chersky range of northeastern Siberia. But here, elevation is only a small part of the problem. In winter, temperatures can fall to around -50 degrees Celsius. In 2018, Simone Moro and Tamara Lunga completed the first recorded winter ascent. On February 11th, they spent around 7 hours reaching the summit, followed by another 4 hours descending to camp. The day's total journey covered roughly 27.3 kilometers, with more than 2,000 meters of cumulative elevation gain. Near the summit, temperatures could fall to around -30 to -35 degrees Celsius. But the danger isn't just the number on a thermometer. Boots can freeze overnight. Wind can destroy tents. Batteries and electronic equipment can lose performance. And every small mistake becomes more serious when you are far from any support. This is the kind of mountain where you can't simply ask, "Can I climb it?" You have to ask, "Can I survive long enough to climb back down?" From Siberia, we make an almost complete environmental reversal. We leave the frozen wilderness and head somewhere where water can be more valuable than gold. The Sahara Desert. 5. Emi Koussi, Chad. Emi Koussi rises to around 3,415 meters and is the highest peak in the Sahara. But its elevation alone doesn't describe its true scale. The volcanic system stretches for roughly 65 kilometers. The summit caldera region measures around 12 by 15 kilometers, and the mountain rises approximately 2.3 kilometers above the surrounding plains. This is not an isolated mountain sitting in an easily accessible landscape. It lies deep within the Tibesti Mountains of northern Chad. To reach it, an expedition may need off-road vehicles, fuel, water, food, and equipment in an environment where the distances between sources of support can be enormous. Here, every liter of fuel matters. Every container of water matters. And a vehicle breakdown can turn a mountain expedition into a survival situation. The remarkable thing is that Emi Koussi isn't necessarily an extreme technical climb. The real problem is getting people, vehicles, and all the necessary logistics to the mountain in the first place. Sometimes the mountain doesn't defeat you. The road to the mountain does. But there is one place where even the road may not be the biggest obstacle. Because at the next mountain, the first question isn't whether you are strong enough. It's whether you are even allowed to go there. 4. Mount Paektu, China, North Korea. Mount Paektu rises to around 2,744 meters and sits directly on the border between China and North Korea. At its summit lies Heaven Lake, a huge body of water inside the volcanic crater. But Paektu is famous for more than its landscape. Around 946, a massive volcanic eruption occurred here. The eruption is estimated at least weigh 6, releasing roughly 13 to 47 cubic kilometers of magma. But today, what makes Paektu difficult to access for many people isn't underground. It's on the map. The border. The Chinese side has controlled tourist routes. The North Korean side has much stricter restrictions, so a person can have the fitness, equipment, and climbing experience required. But that still doesn't guarantee they can freely access every side of the mountain. Paektu raises a very different question. If you don't have the freedom to reach a mountain, how much does climbing skill really matter? But at number 3, the border becomes an even more direct obstacle. We move toward Kazakhstan and China. There, a peak approaching 4,000 meters remains trapped by access restrictions and the challenges of reaching its true summit. 3. Sauyr Zhotasy, Kazakhstan, China. Sauyr Zhotasy rises to around 3,840 meters. But the number that makes it especially impressive is its roughly 3,250 meters of topographic prominence. That means the mountain rises dramatically above the surrounding landscape. Climbers have reached areas close to the summit. In 2017, Ed Hannum and his teammates attempted an approach from the south. In 2018, they returned and tried another route from the northeast. But this isn't a place where simply finding a good climbing route is enough. There are border controls, remote terrain, glaciers, limited mapping, and permit issues. A climbing team can spend enormous amounts of time getting close to the mountain, only to be stopped by an obstacle that cannot be solved with ropes or crampons. That is the paradox of Sauyr Zhotasy. The mountain itself may not defeat you. The border might stop you first. But if a mountain on an international border is difficult to reach, imagine one with no roads, no towns, and a location deep within the frozen waters of Antarctica. We are approaching number 2, Mount Siple, Antarctica. Mount Siple rises to around 3,162 meters on Siple Island off the coast of Antarctica. What makes it unusual is that its topographic prominence is also roughly 3,162 meters. That's because the base of the mountain effectively begins near sea level. At the summit is a caldera about 4 kilometers wide. But even these numbers don't explain the biggest challenge. Siple Island is uninhabited. No roads, no towns, no rescue facilities. And the island is separated from mainland Antarctica by the Getz ice shelf. To reach Mount Siple, an expedition first has to transport an entire team into one of the most remote marine regions on Earth. Then they have to find a way ashore. Then cross the icy terrain. And only after all of that can they even think about climbing the mountain. Mount Siple is still commonly listed as unclimbed, and that is what makes it so remarkable. Humans can see the mountain from satellites. We can measure its elevation. We can map it. We can study its shape from a screen. But turning a point on Google Earth into a real footprint on the summit is an entirely different story. And now, only one mountain remains. A mountain lower than every peak we have just seen. Yet somehow, it holds the number 1 position. We leave Antarctica. We head north, deep into the Amazon rainforest of Peru. 1. Cerro El Cono, Peru. Cerro El Cono rises to around 735 meters, according to Peakbagger. Its recorded topographic prominence is around 385 meters. If you only look at those numbers, it doesn't seem like a candidate for number 1. It is more than 2,400 meters lower than Mount Siple, almost 2,700 meters lower than Emi Koussi, and more than 2,200 meters lower than Gora Pobeda. But that is exactly what makes Cerro El Cono so fascinating. It rises from the Amazon rainforest like an almost perfectly shaped cone. There is no conventional climbing infrastructure, no established mountain tourism network, no normal rescue system designed for a climbing expedition. And the surrounding region includes protected areas and territories associated with indigenous communities living in isolation. That means access isn't simply a question of money. You can't just hire a helicopter, buy equipment, and enter whenever you want. Even if the legal issues are resolved, the dense rainforest remains, the terrain remains, the distance remains, and the isolation remains. Peakbagger currently does not record a confirmed ascent of Cerro El Cono, and that is why the number 735 meters becomes so important. Because this list was never really about elevation. It was about the distance between humans and the mountain. At Gora Pobeda, that distance is measured in hundreds of kilometers of wilderness and temperatures near -50 degrees Celsius. At Mount Siple, it is measured in ice, ocean, and Antarctic isolation. At Sauyr Zhotasy, it is measured by an international border. But at Cerro El Cono, it is measured by the Amazon rainforest and the restrictions surrounding access to the region. And that is why a mountain only around 735 meters high can take the number 1 position. 10 mountains, 10 different forms of isolation. A place locked behind a 125-meter cliff. A forest covering roughly 7,000 hectares, discovered through satellite imagery. An island about 2,173 kilometers from St. Helena. A 2,735.6-meter summit whose identity was once disputed. A place where temperatures can fall to around -50 degrees Celsius. A Saharan volcano stretching roughly 65 kilometers across. A mountain responsible for an eruption involving roughly 13 to 47 cubic kilometers of magma. A peak with around 3,250 meters of prominence, sitting on an international border. A 3,162-meter Antarctic mountain with almost no practical infrastructure. And finally, an Amazonian cone standing only about 735 meters high. These numbers reveal one thing. Elevation does not determine how difficult a mountain is to reach, because sometimes the greatest challenge isn't the summit. It's the entire journey required to reach the mountain in the first place.